Maria Santos had always been a fighter, but nothing could have prepared her for what happened on that rainy Tuesday morning in the mountains of Colombia. The 28-year-old helicopter pilot was on a routine medical supply run to remote villages when her aircraft was forced down by armed men who appeared from the thick jungle like ghosts. The rebels had been tracking her helicopter for weeks. Knowing that medical supply runs meant valuable cargo and potential hostages, they fired warning shots that shattered her windscreen and damaged her tail rotor, forcing Maria to make an emergency landing in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. Her hands trembled as she shut down the engine, knowing that her life had just taken a devastating turn. As masked gunmen surrounded her helicopter, Maria tried to stay calm. She had heard stories of what happened to pilots who fell into rebel hands, and none of them ended well. The leader, a man with cold eyes and scars across his face, gestured for her to step out slowly. Maria complied, raising her hands above her head while her mind raced through possible escape scenarios. The rebels quickly searched her helicopter, taking medical supplies, communication equipment, and anything else they deemed valuable. They bound her hands with rough rope and blindfolded her with a dirty cloth that smelled of diesel fuel. Maria felt herself being pushed forward into the jungle, stumbling over roots and rocks as branches scratched at her arms and face. For 3 hours, they marched deeper into the wilderness. Maria tried to memorize the path, counting steps and noting the sounds around her. She heard a river flowing somewhere to her left, the calls of exotic birds overhead, and the constant buzz of insects. Every detail could be important if she ever got a chance to escape. When they finally stopped, Maria was pushed into a makeshift camp hidden beneath the forest canopy. Tattered tarps stretched between trees provided minimal shelter. The smell of wood smoke mixed with unwashed bodies filled the air. She counted at least 15 voices around her, speaking in hushed Spanish about their new prisoner. The blindfold was removed, revealing a crude jungle hideout that looked like it had been there for years. Weapons were stacked against trees, and ammunition boxes served as furniture. Maria's pilot training had taught her to assess situations quickly, and she immediately began cataloging everything she saw. Guard positions, weapon locations, possible escape routes. Her mind worked like a computer storing critical data. They pushed her into a small wooden cage barely large, enough for her to sit upright. The bamboo bars were thick and sturdy, and a heavy padlock secured the door. As night fell, Maria listened to the rebels talking around their campfire, discussing ransom demands and how long they planned to keep her. Their leader, who the others called Captain Valdez, seemed particularly interested in her piloting skills. Maria had grown up in a military family and learned early that showing fear only made captors more confident. She kept her expression neutral and her breathing steady, even as her heart pounded with terror. Inside, she began formulating a plan. These men had made one critical mistake. They had captured someone who knew helicopters better than they knew their own weapons. During her first night in captivity, Maria barely slept. She studied the guard rotation, noting that they became lazy during the early morning hours. She observed their weapons handling, their communication patterns, and most importantly, their arrogance. They saw her as just another helpless victim, a woman who would cry and beg for mercy. They had no idea they had captured a former military pilot who had trained for exactly these kinds of situations. As dawn broke through the jungle canopy, Maria began the most dangerous game of her life. She would need to convince her captors that she was broken and submissive while secretly planning their downfall. The helicopter that had brought her to this nightmare might just become the key to her salvation. If she could stay alive long enough to reach it. 3 days into her captivity, Maria began implementing her survival strategy. She had observed that Captain Valdez was fascinated by her helicopter and constantly asked his men about its condition. This gave her the opening she needed to begin her psychological manipulation. When the captain approached her cage that morning, Maria looked up with what she hoped appeared to be defeated eyes. She had deliberately messed her hair and allowed tears to streak down her face, creating the image of a broken woman. Valdez studied her for a long moment before speaking. "Your helicopter interests me, pilot," he said in accented English. "My men tell me it still runs despite the damage." Maria nodded weakly, playing her role perfectly. Yes, sir. The damage isn't too bad. Just the windscreen and some tail rotor issues. Nothing that can't be fixed with basic tools. She kept her voice small and submissive. Exactly what he would expect from a terrified captive. Valdez smiled coldly. Good. You will teach my pilot how to fly it properly. Rodriguez knows the basics, but he crashes more than he flies. He gestured toward a nervous-looking man cleaning a rifle nearby. You will make him better, or you will not eat. This was exactly what Maria had hoped for. Access to the helicopter and a chance to influence their operations. She nodded eagerly, perhaps too eagerly, then caught herself and looked down at her hands. I'll do whatever you want. I just want to go home. Over the next several days, Maria was escorted to her helicopter under heavy guard. The aircraft sat in the same clearing where she had been forced to land, now covered with camouflage netting. Her heart ached, seeing her beautiful machine treated so roughly, but she maintained her submissive facade while secretly assessing the real damage. The helicopter was in better condition than she had led them to believe. The windscreen was cracked but still functional, and the tail rotor damage was purely cosmetic. Her emergency landing had been more skilled than she had let on, and the aircraft was still fully operational. She kept this information to herself while pretending to explain basic flight principles to Rodriguez. Rodriguez was a disaster as a pilot. He had some experience with small aircraft, but none with helicopters, and his attempts at hovering nearly resulted in crashes that would have destroyed the machine entirely. Maria had to bite her tongue to keep from screaming at his incompetence while maintaining her act of a helpful, frightened prisoner. The collective controls altitude, she explained patiently as Rodriguez jerked the helicopter around like a drunk dancer. Smooth movements. The machine responds to your thoughts, not your panic. She demonstrated the proper grip and movement, all while memorizing the fuel gauge readings and checking the condition of critical systems. During these training sessions, Maria began to notice patterns in the rebels' behavior. They were planning something big, and her helicopter was crucial to their plans. She overheard conversations about moving weapons and attacking a government outpost in the valley below. They needed air support, and they believed they now had a pilot capable of providing it. What they didn't realize was that Maria was already 3 steps ahead of them. During each training session, she made subtle adjustments to the helicopter systems. She loosened bolts that would cause vibrations, adjusted the fuel mixture to create performance issues, and memorized every detail of the aircraft's condition. Most importantly, she began hiding supplies. Every day she managed to conceal small items that might prove useful later. A knife from their lunch, extra fuel line from the maintenance kit, emergency flares from the survival equipment. She hid these treasures in various locations around the helicopter where the guards wouldn't notice them during their casual inspections. The rebels grew more confident as Rodriguez showed minimal improvement. They began discussing their upcoming mission more openly around Maria, assuming she was too broken and frightened to pose any threat. Captain Valdez even began treating her almost kindly, bringing her better food and allowing her to wash in the nearby stream under guard. You are proving very useful, pilot, he told her one evening as she sat in her cage. Perhaps when our mission is complete, we will let you live. You could be valuable to our cause. Maria nodded gratefully. But inside, she was calculating distances, fuel consumption, and flight paths. The rebels' confidence was becoming their weakness, and she was carefully nurturing that overconfidence. Soon, they would make the mistake of trusting their broken little captive just enough to give her the opportunity she needed as she lay in her cage that night. Listening to the jungle sounds and the rebels snoring, Maria smiled in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring another training session, another chance to prepare for the moment when the hunter would become the hunted. The rebels thought they had captured a helpless pilot, but they had actually invited a wolf into their camp. 2 weeks into her captivity, Maria had become an expert at reading the rebels' routines and weaknesses. She had also grown closer to understanding their ultimate plan, which was far more dangerous than she had initially realized. The rebels weren't just planning to attack a government outpost, they were preparing to assault a school where children studied. Using her helicopter as their primary weapon, the revelation came during an overheard conversation between Captain Valdez and his lieutenant. They spoke in rapid Spanish, assuming Maria couldn't understand their dialect. But her mother had been from this region, and she caught every terrifying word. The attack was scheduled for the following week, during a parent-teacher conference when maximum casualties could be achieved. Maria's blood ran cold as she realized the true scope of what they were planning. This wasn't just about her survival anymore. Dozens of innocent children would die if she didn't find a way to stop this mission. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like a lead blanket, but it also crystallized her resolve. She had to act, and she had to act soon. That night, she finalized her escape plan. Over the past 2 weeks, she had carefully studied every aspect of the camp's security and the rebels' behavior patterns. The guards changed shifts at 2 a.m. and 6 a.m., with the most relaxed supervision occurring during the pre-dawn hours. Most importantly, she had noticed that they always left 2 men to guard the helicopter, and these guards often fell asleep around 4 a.m. Maria had also been carefully sabotaging Rodriguez's training progress. While appearing to help him improve, she had actually been teaching him incorrect procedures and reinforcing his bad habits. He now believed he was a competent pilot, but in reality, he was more dangerous than ever. This overconfidence would be crucial to her plan. The next morning brought another training session. But this time Maria felt the weight of her impending action. As Rodriguez struggled through basic hover exercises, she made her final preparations. She retrieved the emergency flare she had hidden in the maintenance compartment and tucked it into her sleeve. She also loosened the bolt on the collective stick just enough to cause it to slip at a critical moment. "You're improving," she lied to Rodriguez, who had just nearly crashed into a tree. "Tomorrow, you'll be ready for more advanced maneuvers." She saw the pride in his eyes and felt a twinge of guilt. Knowing that his overconfidence might cost him his life, Captain Valdez watched the training session with satisfaction. "Excellent work, pilot. Rodriguez tells me he feels ready to fly the mission." He looked at Maria with something approaching fondness. "Your cooperation has been noted. When this is over, you may find yourself with more freedom in our organization." Maria nodded submissively while her mind raced through final calculations. The helicopter held enough fuel for approximately 2 hours of flight time. The government airbase was 40 minutes away at maximum speed. She would need to disable the rebels quickly and then get airborne before they could organize a proper response. The margin for error was practically non-existent that evening. As she sat in her cage, Maria went through her plan one final time. At 4 a.m., when the helicopter guards were most likely to be drowsy, she would use the knife she had stolen to cut through the rope that secured her cage door. The lock was old and rusty. She had noticed that it could be lifted slightly if the rope tension was relieved. Once free, she would need to move silently through the camp to reach the helicopter. She had memorized the location of every sleeping rebel and identified the quietest path through the jungle undergrowth. The guards at the helicopter would be her biggest challenge, but she had a plan for them too. Hidden near the aircraft was the emergency flare she had concealed during her last training session. If she could reach it without being detected, she could use it to create a distraction while she overcame the guards. The flare would also serve as a signal to any government forces in the area, potentially bringing help if her escape attempt failed, as the camp settled into sleep around her. Maria lay perfectly still and controlled her breathing. She had trained for combat situations during her military service, but this was different. This wasn't a training exercise with safety nets and backup plans. This was life or death, not just for her, but for all the innocent children who would suffer if she failed. The jungle sounds seemed louder than usual that night. The calls of night birds, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, the distant sound of the river. Maria memorized each sound, knowing that tomorrow night, if she was successful, she would be sleeping in safety while these rebels faced the consequences of their actions. Around midnight, she began her final preparations. She worked the rope around her wrists, loosening it just enough to slip free when the time came. She positioned the stolen knife where she could reach it quickly, and she mentally rehearsed every step of her escape route. There would be no second chances, no time for hesitation. When 4 a.m. arrived, she would either be flying toward freedom or she would be dead. At exactly 3:45 a.m., Maria began her escape. The camp was at its quietest, with only the soft snoring of sleeping rebels and the gentle sounds of the jungle night. She had been awake for hours, her body tense with anticipation, waiting for this precise moment when the guards would be at their most vulnerable, using the knife she had concealed for weeks. Maria carefully cut through the rope that held her cage door. Her hands moved with surgical precision, each cut deliberate and silent. The old lock gave way just as she had predicted, and the bamboo door opened with barely a whisper. She paused, listening for any change in the camp's rhythm. But the rebels continued sleeping peacefully. Maria slipped from her cage like a shadow, her bare feet making no sound on the damp earth. She had memorized every obstacle in her path during her weeks of captivity. And now, she moved through the sleeping camp with the stealth of a predator. Past the smoldering campfire, around the stack of weapons. Between the sleeping forms of her captors, each step brought her closer to her aircraft and her freedom. The two guards at the helicopter were exactly where she expected them to be. Leaning against trees with their rifles across their laps, both were dozing fitfully, their heads nodding as they fought off sleep. Maria crept to within 10 feet of them and retrieved the emergency flare she had hidden during her last training session. This was the most dangerous part of her plan. She needed to neutralize both guards simultaneously before either could raise an alarm. Maria had learned hand-to-hand combat during her military training, but she had never used those skills in a real life-or-death situation. Her heart pounded so loudly, she was certain the guards would hear it. Moving with lightning speed, Maria struck the first guard with the butt of her knife, catching him behind the ear. He slumped forward without a sound. The second guard stirred at the movement, but before he could fully wake, Maria had wrapped her arm around his throat and applied pressure to his carotid artery. Within seconds, he too was unconscious. Maria quickly secured both guards with their own rope, ensuring they couldn't wake up and immediately sound an alarm. She then turned her attention to her beloved helicopter, running her hands over the controls like greeting an old friend. Everything was exactly as she remembered. The rebels had been careful not to damage their valuable prize. She removed the camouflage, netting with practiced efficiency, and began her pre-flight check. Fuel levels were adequate for her escape. All systems appeared operational, and the engine turned over smoothly on the first attempt. The familiar hum of the rotors spinning up was the most beautiful sound she had heard in weeks, but as Maria prepared for takeoff, disaster struck. One of the unconscious guards stirred and managed to let out a weak shout before falling silent again. The sound wasn't loud, but in the quiet of the early morning, it carried through the camp like a gunshot. Within seconds, Maria heard voices and the sound of running feet. The pilot, the helicopter. Captain Valdez's voice cut through the darkness like a blade. Flashlight beams began sweeping through the camp, and Maria knew she had perhaps 30 seconds before they reached her position. Without hesitation, she pulled pitch and lifted off into the dark sky. The helicopter rose above the forest canopy just as the first rebels reached the clearing. Their weapons raised and their faces twisted with rage and confusion. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness below as they opened fire, but Maria was already climbing rapidly away from their effective range. "Rodriguez, get the radio. Contact base camp." She heard Valdez screaming below. But his words were already growing faint as distance increased between her and the ground. Maria banked the helicopter toward the northeast. Following the river she had memorized during her forced march weeks, earlier the fuel gauge showed she had enough power to reach the government airbase, but barely. She would need to fly efficiently, avoiding unnecessary maneuvers that would waste precious fuel. Behind her, she could see lights beginning to appear in the rebel camp as they organized a pursuit. But without aircraft of their own, they had no way to follow her into the sky as the first hints of dawn appeared on the horizon. Maria allowed herself a moment of triumph. She had done it. She had escaped from her captors and was flying toward safety. But her celebration was short-lived as she remembered the rebels' planned attack on the school. Her escape was only the beginning. Now she had to ensure that their terrorist mission could never be completed. Banking. The helicopter toward the government airbase, Maria began composing the report she would give to military authorities. Captain Valdez and his rebels had made a fatal mistake when they captured her. They had given her access to their plans, their location, and most importantly, they had underestimated her determination to stop them. The jungle spread out below her like a green carpet, beautiful and peaceful in the morning light. Soon, it would be filled with government troops hunting down the rebels who had thought they could use her as a tool for their twisted mission. As Maria flew toward safety, she smiled grimly. The hunter had indeed become the hunted, and justice was about to rain down from the sky. Maria's helicopter touched down at the government airbase just as the sun was rising over the mountains. Military personnel surrounded her aircraft within seconds, weapons drawn and voices shouting commands in Spanish. She raised her hands high above her head and called out her identification. Explaining that she was the pilot who had been reported missing 3 weeks earlier, Colonel Martinez. The base commander personally debriefed Maria in a secure room while medics checked her for injuries. Her story of capture, deception, and escape seemed almost too incredible to believe. But the intelligence she provided about the rebels, location, and planned attack on the school was specific and detailed enough to convince even the most skeptical officers. "You're certain about this school attack?" Colonel Martinez asked, studying a map where Maria had marked the rebel camp's location. "Our intelligence suggested they were planning to hit a government facility, not a civilian target." Maria's eyes blazed with determination as she responded, "Absolutely certain, Colonel. I heard Captain Valdez discussing it multiple times. They plan to use my helicopter to attack during the parent-teacher conference next Thursday. They want maximum civilian casualties to make a political statement." The colonel immediately activated the base's emergency response protocols. Within an hour, 3 military helicopters were fueled and ready for departure. Carrying elite soldiers trained in jungle warfare and hostage rescue operations, Maria insisted on joining the mission despite the colonel's initial protests. "With respect, sir, I know that camp better than anyone," she argued. "I've memorized their guard positions, weapon locations, and daily routines. Your soldiers will need every advantage they can get in that jungle terrain." Reluctantly, Colonel Martinez agreed, but only if Maria remained in her helicopter during the actual assault. Her job would be to provide aerial reconnaissance and coordinate the ground attack, not to engage in direct combat. Maria accepted these conditions, though privately she had no intention of staying on the sidelines if the situation deteriorated. The flight back to the rebel camp took 45 minutes. With Maria leading the formation in her familiar aircraft, while the military helicopters followed in tactical formation. As they approached the jungle area, Maria felt her pulse quicken. She was returning to the place of her captivity. But this time, she was in control. Through her headset, she coordinated with the ground team leader, Captain Reyes, describing the layout of the camp and identifying the most likely positions where the rebels would make their stand. Her weeks of careful observation were finally paying off as she guided the soldiers to optimal insertion points around the perimeter. The camp is in a natural depression about 200 meters ahead, Maria radioed. Captain Valdez keeps his command post under the large cecropia tree at the eastern edge. Their weapons cache is in the liento shelter near the stream. Watch for sentries in the trees. They have at least 3 elevated positions. The military helicopters deployed their troops with precision, inserting soldiers at strategic points that would allow them to surround the camp completely. Maria hovered overhead, using her helicopter's surveillance equipment to track rebel movements and relay information to the ground forces below. The rebels, who had spent the morning frantically searching for any trace of Maria's escape route, were caught completely off guard by the sudden appearance of government forces. The attack began at exactly 10:30 a.m. with flashbang grenades that disoriented the rebels and allowed the soldiers to advance rapidly into the camp. From her aerial vantage point, Maria watched with grim satisfaction as the rebels who had held her captive were systematically whelmed by superior tactics and firepower. Captain Valdez tried to rally his men for a final stand near their weapons cache, but he was quickly surrounded and forced to surrender. Rodriguez, the would-be pilot who Maria had been training, attempted to flee into the jungle, but was captured within minutes by soldiers who had anticipated his escape route. As Maria watched him being led away in handcuffs, she felt a mixture of relief and sadness. His overconfidence in his flying abilities had been part of her escape plan. But she took no pleasure in seeing another human being defeated. The entire operation lasted less than 30 minutes. 15 rebels were captured alive, including Captain Valdez, while 3 others were killed during brief exchanges of gunfire. Most importantly, the soldiers discovered extensive evidence of the planned school attack, including detailed maps, photographs of the target building, and a timeline for the assault. As the last rebel was loaded onto a transport helicopter, Colonel Martinez radioed Maria with his congratulations. "Outstanding work, pilot. Your intelligence was perfect, and your courage saved countless innocent lives. The government will want to recognize your service with appropriate honors." But Maria wasn't thinking about medals or recognition as she flew back to the airbase. She was thinking about the children who would attend school safely next week, unaware that they had been targeted by terrorists. She was thinking about other pilots who might be captured in the future, and whether they would have the knowledge and determination needed to escape similar situations. Landing back at the base, Maria was surrounded by cheering soldiers and officers who had monitored the mission's progress. News reporters were already gathering at the base perimeter, eager to interview the pilot who had outsmarted her captors and prevented a terrorist attack. Maria smiled wearily as she shut down her helicopter's engine, knowing that her ordeal was finally over. But as she climbed from her aircraft, Maria made a silent promise to herself. She would use her experience to train other pilots in survival techniques and escape procedures. No one else should have to endure what she had suffered, and if they did, they would be better prepared to fight back. The rebels had made a fatal mistake when they underestimated her, and she would make sure that mistake was never repeated. The interrogation of Captain Valdez and his captured rebels revealed the full scope of their terrorist network, which extended far beyond the jungle camp where Maria had been held. Intelligence officers discovered connections to international arms dealers, drug cartels, and other rebel groups throughout South America. Maria's escape had not just prevented one attack, it had exposed an entire criminal organization. During her own debriefing sessions, which lasted for several days, Maria provided detailed information about everything she had observed during her captivity. Military intelligence officers were amazed by the precision of her observations and her ability to remember conversations, guard rotations, and weapon placements with photographic accuracy. Most kidnapping victims are too traumatized to provide useful intelligence, explained Major Santos, the base intelligence officer. But you turned your captivity into a reconnaissance mission. Your military training clearly served you well in an impossible situation, the evidence recovered from the rebel camp painted a disturbing picture of their planned attack. They had been planning to strike during a special assembly at the international school, where many diplomats' children studied. The attack would have been timed to coincide with a live television broadcast of a cultural performance, ensuring maximum global impact for their terrorist message. Maria shuddered when she realized how close they had come to success. If she had not escaped when she did, Rodriguez would have attempted to fly the mission in just 3 more days. Even with his poor piloting skills, he might have managed to reach the school and cause massive casualties before crashing. News of Maria's story spread quickly through Colombian society and then internationally. She became an overnight hero, with newspapers calling her the pilot who fought back and the woman who saved a school. Television news, programs wanted interviews, and the government planned to award her the highest civilian honor for courage, but Maria found the attention overwhelming and often retreated to the quiet hangar where her helicopter was undergoing repairs. The aircraft had suffered more damage during her escape than she had initially realized. With bullet holes in the fuselage and stress fractures in the rotor assembly, seeing her machine wounded made the reality of her ordeal more concrete than all the debriefings and interviews combined. 3 weeks after her escape, Maria received an unexpected visitor at the airbase. Elena Rodriguez, the mother of Miguel Rodriguez, the rebel pilot she had been forced to train, came to see her with tears in her eyes, a request that broke Maria's heart. "I know my son made terrible choices," Elena said, clutching a photograph of Miguel as a young boy. "But he wasn't always like this. The rebels recruited him when he was hungry and desperate. I don't ask you to forgive him, but please don't let his mistakes define who he was before he lost his way." Maria listened to Elena's story with growing compassion. Miguel had been a talented mechanic who dreamed of becoming a pilot. But poverty and limited opportunities had made him vulnerable to the rebels' promises. His mother had tried to convince him to leave the group, but he had been too afraid of retaliation to abandon his comrades. The conversation with Elena forced Maria to confront the complex reality behind her ordeal. While she could never excuse the rebels' actions or their planned attack on innocent children, she began to understand that some of her captors had been victims of circumstances beyond their control. This realization didn't diminish her anger at what they had planned to do, but it added layers of nuance to her feelings about the situation as the investigation continued. Authorities discovered that the rebel group had been planning similar attacks in other countries. Maria's intelligence helped international law enforcement agencies track down weapons, suppliers, and financial backers who had enabled the terrorists' activities. Arrests were made in Panama, Venezuela, and even as far away as Europe. The school that had been targeted held a special assembly to honor Maria and the soldiers who had prevented the attack. She was invited to speak to the students, many of whom were the same age as the victims the rebels had planned to kill. Looking out at their young faces, Maria felt the full weight of what her escape had accomplished. "Sometimes we face situations that seem impossible," she told the assembled children. "But if we stay calm, think clearly, and never give up hope, we can overcome challenges that seem too big for us. The most important thing is to remember that there are always people who care about us and will help us when we need it most." After the ceremony, Maria met privately with several children whose parents worked for the diplomatic corps. They had been specifically targeted in the rebels' planning documents. Their families wanted to thank her personally for saving their lives. These conversations reinforced Maria's decision about what she wanted to do next with her life. Colonel Martinez offered Maria a position with military intelligence, recognizing her unique combination of piloting skills, survival training, and ability to remain calm under extreme pressure. Government officials suggested she could write a book about her experience or become a spokesperson for anti-terrorism efforts. But Maria had already decided on a different path. She wanted to return to her original job as a medical supply pilot. But with an expanded mission, she would also train other civilian pilots in survival techniques and resistance methods, could help them if they ever faced similar situations. Her ordeal had taught her that preparation and mental strength could overcome seemingly impossible odds, and she wanted to share that knowledge with others who might need it someday. 6 months after her escape, Maria stood before her first class of civilian pilots at the newly established Survival Training Center in Bogotá. The facility had been funded by the government and several international organizations who recognized the need for better preparation among pilots operating in dangerous regions around the world. "Your aircraft is more than just a machine," Maria told her students, many of whom were young pilots just starting their careers. "It's your lifeline, your weapon, and potentially your salvation if things go wrong. Understanding every system, every capability, and every limitation could mean the difference between life and death." The training program Maria developed combined practical survival skills with psychological preparation for captivity situations. Students learned how to maintain mental clarity under extreme stress, how to observe and remember crucial details about their captors, and how to identify opportunities for escape that others might miss. Maria's helicopter had been fully repaired and returned to service, bearing new scars that told the story of her ordeal. She continued flying medical supply missions to remote villages. But now her aircraft was equipped with enhanced communication systems and emergency beacons that would make it much harder for hostile forces to isolate her from help. The international attention surrounding Maria's story had positive effects. Beyond her immediate situation, airlines and charter services began implementing new security protocols for flights in regions where kidnapping was a risk. Pilot training programs worldwide started including modules on survival psychology and resistance. techniques that drew directly from Maria's experience. Captain Valdez and his surviving rebels were tried and convicted of terrorism charges, receiving long prison sentences that would keep them away from society for decades. During his trial, Valdez showed no remorse for his actions. But several of his younger followers expressed regret and asked for forgiveness from their victims. Families. Miguel Rodriguez, the would-be pilot, received a lighter sentence in exchange for providing information about other rebel cells and weapons suppliers. His mother, Alina, visited Maria several times during the months following the rescue operation, and the two women developed an unlikely friendship based on their shared experience of surviving trauma. Miguel wants to write you a letter, Alina told Maria during one of their visits. He understands that you were just trying to survive, and he knows his choices led him to that camp. He doesn't expect forgiveness, but he wants you to know that he's grateful you showed him mercy when you could have taught him to crash the helicopter deliberately. Maria had indeed considered sabotaging Rodriguez's training more severely, potentially causing him to crash during a practice flight. But her conscience wouldn't allow her to deliberately cause someone's death, even someone who was planning to participate in terrorism. That decision had probably saved Rodriguez's life and allowed him the chance at redemption he was now pursuing in prison. The school that had been targeted by the rebels established an annual scholarship in Maria's name, providing flight training opportunities for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. The scholarship program aimed to show that aviation careers could provide positive alternatives to the criminal activities that had trapped people like Miguel Rodriguez. Maria often visited the school to speak with scholarship recipients and other students about the importance of making good choices even when faced with difficult circumstances. Her message was always the same, that courage and determination could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, and that everyone had the power to choose between helping others and causing harm. On the first anniversary of her escape, Maria returned to the site of the former rebel camp, now empty except for a small government monitoring station. Standing in the clearing where her helicopter had been forced down, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just 12 months. The experience had left her with nightmares and moments of intense anxiety, but it had also revealed strengths she never knew she possessed. More importantly, it had shown her that survival was not just about staying alive. It was about maintaining your humanity and your sense of justice, even in the darkest circumstances. As she prepared to leave the jungle clearing that day, Maria noticed something growing near where her cage had been located. A small cecropia tree, the same species that had sheltered Captain Valdez's command post, was pushing up through the forest floor. New life was already reclaiming the space where so much darkness had occurred. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. Just as the jungle was healing itself, she too was growing stronger from her ordeal. The trauma would always be part of her story, but it no longer defined her entire existence. She had transformed her victimization into empowerment, her fear into determination, and her suffering into a mission to help others. Maria's survival training program expanded internationally over the following years, with pilots from dozens of countries coming to study her methods. She worked with military advisors, psychologists, and other survival experts to refine the curriculum and ensure it remained current with evolving threats around the world. Her story was eventually made into a documentary that won several international awards and helped raise awareness about the dangers faced by civilian pilots in conflict zones. The film also highlighted the work of organizations providing humanitarian aid in remote regions, showing how people like Maria risk their lives daily to help others in need. 5 years after her escape, Maria married Captain Reyes, the soldier who had led the ground assault on the rebel camp. Their relationship had developed slowly over the years as they worked together on various security and training initiatives. They found in each other partners who understood the realities of danger and the importance of serving something greater than themselves. Their wedding was a small ceremony attended by many of the people whose lives had been touched by Maria's story. Alina Rodriguez was there, along with several of the scholarship recipients from the targeted school. Colonel Martinez gave a toast that brought tears to many eyes. Speaking about how Maria had shown that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they refused to surrender to fear, Maria's helicopter, now retired from active service, was donated to the Aviation Museum in Bogotá, where it served as the centerpiece of an exhibit about civilian courage under fire. A plaque next to the aircraft told the story of her escape and rescue mission, inspiring countless visitors to consider their own capacity for bravery in difficult situations. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Miguel Rodriguez, now serving the final years of his reduced sentence, had earned his pilot's license through a prison education program and was planning to work for humanitarian organizations. Upon his release, he wrote Maria a letter thanking her for showing him that aviation could be used to save lives rather than take them. You've taught me more about flying in those few weeks than I learned in years of dreaming about it, he wrote. But more importantly, you showed me that true strength comes from helping others, not from causing them harm. I hope someday I can use what you taught me to make amends for the terrible things I was planning to do. Maria framed that letter and hung it in her office at the training center. It served as a daily reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, there was always potential for redemption and positive change. The rebels who had captured her thinking she was just another helpless victim had inadvertently created a force for justice and education that would protect countless others in the years to come. As she looked out the window of her office each morning, watching new classes of pilots prepare for the challenges they might face in dangerous parts of the world, Maria felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had taken the worst experience of her life and transformed it into something that would help others survive and overcome their own impossible situations. The woman who had once been seen as merely a captive had indeed seized control of her destiny and struck back against those who threatened innocent lives. But her greatest victory wasn't her dramatic escape or the successful rescue mission that followed. Her greatest victory was proving that one person's courage and determination could create ripples of positive change that would continue long after her own story was finished.